Neighborhood History channel and to our live stream lecture. You are joining us on Sundays, and Sundays is the day for a live stream lecture where I cover a particular historical topic, usually one that you vote on, or if there's a special occasion like last Sunday, we covered all of February's holidays, be it Black History Month, Valentine's Day, and President's Day, all in President's Day weekend when we celebrated our 2-year anniversary. So we are now 1 week into our 3rd year here at the Friendly Neighborhood History channel of creating historical content, shorts, long form, and lives. And now we are doing our live stream lecture as usual on Sundays. And this one you got to vote on, and the fans voted, and they decided you can vote here exclusively on YouTube. You can become a Friendly Neighborhood Historian by liking and subscribing. And the fans decided exclusively that they wanted to talk about the Soviet Union. Well, it wasn't exclusive. It was actually a pretty close vote. I need to plug in my microphone, by the way. But they wanted to discuss the issues regarding the Soviet Union, which is I've done 2 historical lectures now on the history of Russia. I am a Russian historian by trade. Of course, I would like to believe I have an expertise and valuable input on other types of history. But Russian history is particularly formidable, is my particular form of expertise. So I'm just picking backgrounds here that I'm going to be using. So I'd like to think I can contribute important and interesting information about all types of history, but Russian history is something that I am very passionate about. I talked, at length. I answered a question yesterday for at least 5 or 6 minutes during our Q&As, which are every Friday and Saturday, by the way, here on YouTube, about the... I discussed at length in a lot of great detail about why the Soviet Union, about the Russian Civil War. And so if you didn't hear that, you're going to hear it again. And if you did hear that, you'll probably hear a different iteration about that because I don't have notes, I don't have a script, I go off the cuff in discussing all of these different things. So I'm not looking at the chat right now. I won't interact with the chat too much, but please check out all the information, all the content we have. We have an entire series on Russian history, an entire series of shorts and long-form videos on the Russian czars. We haven't finished the Russian history series. We've barely gotten into into the Soviet Union era there. So a lot of what I'm going to say here will be said again in videos later on about Russian history. So I'm trying to finish up that series. So I did a long-form video on the Russian Civil War, on the Russian Revolution that I suggest you check out. And I have also done a lot on the Russian Civil War and things like that, and the fall of the Romanovs, the rise of the Bolsheviks, and that's where we're going to start. That's basically where I left off. So this is a 3-part live stream lecture series that I've been doing. The first one was on the early parts of Russian history up till 1547. The second part was about the Romanovs, and this one is now about the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union. So sit back, get something to drink, enjoy your afternoon with me here, a pleasant Sunday afternoon, talking about history in friendly terms, in a neighborly manner, in a welcoming manner, a manner that makes you feel right at home and like history is enjoyable and coming alive. And that's our goal. That's what we strive to do. There is a lot of really unpleasant stuff to discuss today. There is a lot of unfriendly history that will be knocking at our door when we discuss the Soviet Union. The truth of the matter is, for Lenin and Stalin alone, I could discuss I could have an entire live stream lecture for both individuals, and I probably should at some point. They both deserve long-form videos, biographies of their impact on history. 2 of the most impactful men in history, but not necessarily for the best of reasons. So something to consider there is that you can be extraordinarily impactful in Russian history, or in any form of history, and be extraordinarily hated and disliked. So the Russian Revolution is where I left off last time, and I'm going to pick up from there. Again, I'm not interacting with the chat too much because I'm looking for a good background of the Soviet Union right now, and I won't be interacting with the chat. There might be time for Q&A at the end, but I'm going to try to sum up 75 years of Soviet history in only about an hour. I'm going to talk about the Cold War. We're going to talk about the U.S. and its involvement in the Cold War, but the U.S. is going to be a secondary mention. Most of the focus will be on the Soviet Union's perspective during the Cold War. So we're going to talk about the Soviet Union as an entity and an institution. There's a lot to discuss, and again, a lot to unpack. So I'm looking for a good background. I'm going to be switching backgrounds throughout, but I can't seem to find a good background for the Soviet Union. For the, the obvious sign is the hammer and sickle. But yeah. First, I should probably discuss why it is called the Soviet Union. Why do we have this terminology of the Soviet Union? Well, the term Soviet Union is obviously a union of Soviets, it is the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, that encompasses Russia, but also large areas outside of Russia, including the Ukraine, and Belarus and areas of Eastern Europe that were basically under control and domination by the Soviet Union. And this entity, the Soviet Union, was the direct authority above all of these different Soviet unions, if you will, all these different socialist Soviet republics in Eastern Russia, in Eastern Europe, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and of course the most obvious one is Russia itself had its own Soviet government running, or Soviet or union of a Soviet republic, but it was a union of all of these different republics that became known, of course, as the Soviet Union, that we know and love, or know and hate, or whatever iteration you want to say about that. The truth of the matter is that although this country, the Soviet Union, did not control directly Poland and Hungary and areas like this, like you might think, they had a huge hegemonic influence and political influence on Eastern European communist countries after the end of the last World War, what you call World War II, what I believe is World War III. The Soviet Union didn't directly control these areas, but they heavily influenced them, and it was only into the 1980s that influence started to wane. And I think that really this is basically the best place to start, and it's to actually explain what communism is and the doctrines of communism, the doctrines of Marx and Engels. And again, Karl Marx is a guy who deserves his own live stream lecture. Now, this isn't because of some sort of brooding love I have for Marxism or Karl Marx. I don't think communism is necessarily a successful ideology, economically, politically, or socially. So I'm not reading the chat because I'm not reading Wiki, because I'm looking for a background, and now I have a background. I will not be interacting with the chat so much, but you can follow us there if you want further discussions with the channel and interactions with the channel. Let me connect my microphone, and I will be right back. At some point, I'm sure I will do a live stream lecture about Karl Marx and Marxism, but this isn't the place for that. We are looking at Marx from the perspective of what he brings to the table in forms of Marxism and communism, and the story of the Soviet Union and how it got started. At some point, I'm sure I will give a live stream lecture about that. Somebody was asking if this will be a two-parter. My hope is that I can wrap up the Soviet Union in one live stream lecture. I don't know that I will be able to do that. I've already thought I could do Russian history, modern Russian history, Tsarist Russian history, and Soviet history in two different parts, but it turns out this is the third part in the Russian history live stream lecture series. And you can check out my live stream, my short and long form videos about Russian history and Tsarist history here on YouTube. So, the point I'm trying to make is that there is a lot to unpack, and a lot of the figures and things that I touch upon deserve their own live stream lecture. I've given a live stream lecture on the Cold War. My Cold War perspective will be generally from the perspective of the Soviet Union, and will only affect it in as much as I am discussing the history and culture of the Soviet Union. I already explained how the Soviet Union worked, and that it is not specifically only Russia. It is Russia and a bunch of satellite states that are controlled by Russia that all have their own communist government, that have all blended into one called the Soviet Union. And that's not even to mention the satellite states of the Cold War in Eastern Europe, such as Czechoslovakia or Poland. They aren't directly part of the Soviet Union as a political entity, but they are definitely heavily influenced and controlled by the whims of the Kremlin in Moscow. By the way, the Kremlin, which I've discussed in live stream lectures before, will be mentioned as kind of this seat of Russian government. The Kremlin is a fortress that protects some of the most important palaces and churches in Russian history and has been that way since the 15th century. The Russians, Moscow is nothing without the Kremlin. The Russian government and the history of Russia relies on the Kremlin. So when people talk about the Kremlin, it's the same thing as people talking about Washington, D.C. It's a city within a city. It's similar to what Peking was with the Forbidden City for a long time. There's quite a lot of fascinating stuff to discuss there, but that's for another time. What I'm going to discuss today is, of course, the third part of our Russian history series, which is on the Soviet Union, which will include a lot of other places besides Russia, and I'm going to start with Karl Marx. So Karl Marx is a German economic philosopher reflecting upon the French Revolution. He is usually unemployed throughout much of his life, focusing on writing and philosophy. He is very interested in the works of Hegel, who is a German philosopher of the time, and Marx relies on a patron, much like any Renaissance artist or writer. Many people relied on patrons who were wealthy enough to actually fund their work. Marx's partner was a man named Friedrich Engels, whose father owned a factory and was able to actually bankroll much of Marx's writing. And so Marx, working with Engels, produced the 1848 Communist Manifesto. Now, communism wasn't invented solely by Karl Marx. There were iterations and ideas of communism. Communism and socialism are synonymous in the 19th and early 20th century, so when I discuss them in the live stream, I'm going to be using them interchangeably for a long time. So this is not Rasputin, this is Karl Marx, and if you're new, this is the Friendly Neighborhood History channel, and this is our live stream lecture we do every Sunday, and this is our lecture on Soviet history, so I hope you really, really enjoy it. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of history. There might be time for Q&A at the end. I have no idea. My moderators will be holding down the chat, and you can follow us on the social media and check out my series on Russian history. My moderator, Hars, will hopefully put the video of the Russian Revolution as well as my video on Peter the Great and some other stuff from Russian history in the chat, so you can check out my extensive knowledge on this topic and learn something. So Marx basically develops a more codified system and idea and doctrine of communism, which of course also is synonymously called Marxism. And communism basically believes that, taking from Hegel, that everything is materialistic, that there is no spiritual world outside of the world that there is in, and there is a constant series of strife and struggle between all creatures and organisms in every part of the universe. Nature shows this to be the case as prey versus struggles against predator. And basically, there are power dynamics within nature that also affect humanity, since humanity is a part of nature and part of the mammalian species and is basically a civilized animal. The ethics and ideas of a dialectical struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed transform into human society and infect and affect human relations. So power is the number one cause and responsibility and cornerstone for all human relations, be it societal, interracial, international, or interpersonal. So for Marx, human beings are basically the product of the dynamics between human beings on a large and on a small scale in our relationships, both as political creatures and also our scale as individuals, is a series of struggles and strifes that continue to define our entire existence in a materialist world. This is called dialectical materialism. You basically have an us versus them complex that people are forced into. Now, Marx takes a lot of this from the French Revolution. He sees a struggle between the powerful and the not so powerful. He's also borrowing from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in particular, especially a political philosopher by the name of Rousseau. Rousseau advocated that human beings were born free, but were everywhere in chains. That society had basically imprinted upon humans certain responsibilities and difficulties that made life more hard for them, and it was government's job to give people the freedoms that they necessarily needed. Marx takes this and reinterprets this in the form of dialectical materialism to basically be that human beings are indeed products of their society, and their society is always pitting them against different types of people. We are always pitted against something in this world. There is a constant wrestling and fighting against other organisms and ideas and philosophies, and this infects the way political governments and organizations work. Marx believes that there's a Marxist doctrine of history that emerges not just in the Communist Manifesto, but in Marx's later writings. The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848 by Marx and his patron Engels, is actually the bare bones, earliest iteration of these ideas, only apply to the working classes in Europe who are dealing with a mechanized, industrialized society. Marx believed that only an industrialized, mechanized society would be properly suited to actually implement Marxist doctrine correctly. Marx would have been surprised at the Russian Revolution, which was a pre-industrialized or middling industrialized society that wasn't fully developed, having a communist revolution. However, according to the Marxist dialectic, there is always struggle and strife, not just in a mechanized society, but in the earliest and oldest of most ancient of human societies. In the medieval period and in Europe in particular, there was a feudal system, and this feudal system was eventually challenged by the development of market economies, and market economies ran by the laws of supply and demand and the invisible hand, and therefore capitalism, the theories elaborated by philosophers throughout the 18th and 19th century, particularly Adam Smith, is not antithetical to Marxist doctrine. It is in fact necessary in Marxism for capitalism to occur. Basically, Marx predicted and foresaw that any feudal society that had developed in the medieval period in Europe would eventually start to collapse, and the underclass would push them out of power. So it's always the underclass overthrowing the overclass. There is a revolution from below in all of Marx's theories. Basically, there would be, at a certain point, the underclass would realize where it was in the world, how it was being treated, and who was taking advantage of it, and it would call for justice. Sometimes these calls would turn bloody. And therefore, the feudal system would be overthrown, and a bourgeois system would happen. The bourgeoisie, by the way, or bougie, all of these terms are references to aristocratic upper-class people who are liberals, who want liberal democracy, and usually a capitalist system. A bourgeois revolution was necessary for a Marxist revolution in Marxist doctrine. So basically, at some point, the French nobles in the 1780s, which I have an entire video on the French Revolution, which Horace will hopefully put in the chat, where you can learn about how the French Revolution actually took place and why, and you can maybe see how Marx was influenced by it. The French nobility became aware of the abuses of the feudal system, as particularly by the upper crust nobles and the king and the church. And because they became aware of this, they called for a revolution, and they had a political revolution, which was really a revolution of the middle and lower upper class, or upper middle class, whatever you want to call it, against the top 1%. This bourgeois revolution created a capitalist liberal society that would eventually run its course as well. Marx believed in inevitability in history. He believed these were the inevitable results of class consciousness, and he also believed that if we are indeed always struggling by nature and by our societal and society recognizes our nature as struggling, that eventually it is inevitable that people will realize, hey, I am struggling greatly, and it is my job to overthrow those who have oppressed me. So Marx came to the basic idea that the bourgeoisie would then become the upper class. They would create a mechanized and industrialized society, basically playing the rules of the market, the invisible hand, to produce wealth for everybody, but particularly for themselves. And eventually the workers who were being paid menially, being treated menially, and as disposable would eventually realize that they were being taken advantage of by the rich and the powerful. This would lead to the workers, who were called the proletariat in Marxist doctrine, overthrowing the bourgeoisie in a communist revolution. Although it really wasn't a communist revolution for Marx, it's a socialist revolution. This socialist revolution would replace the old governmental structures not with a new upper class, but with a dictatorship of the workers, where the workers would basically overthrow their factory owners, their landowners. They would abolish private property, abolish money, and own the means of production. Basically, everything used in production of different goods and services would then be owned commonly and democratically by everyone working in those factories and industries. Now, I'm not saying I like this or I dislike this. I'm just simply saying what it is. And if you think I'm reading off of ChatGPT or Wikipedia, thank you so much. It's glad to know that my knowledge is that vast that you actually think that I am using an online encyclopedia to produce information that I know off the top of my head. So this is in 1848, by the way, that Marx is proposing these doctrines, and he's reinterpreting what the French Revolution of the 1780s and the 1831 Revolution, which saw radicals on the liberal side try to overthrow the French government. And of course, this is the inspiration for Victor Hugo's famous Les Miserables. So for Marx, a socialist revolution would see the overthrow of the capitalist system, and all of the apparatuses of the capitalist system would then be controlled by the workers, who would create the dictatorship of the proletariat. And then once they were able to fully abolish private property, the economics, and all of the old traditional cultural artifacts of their nation, they would be able to form a communist society with full and complete equal access and equality for all individuals. Anyone who had anything would share it in common with other people. Marx actually bases some of his ideas about early passages from Christianity in the New Testament, where the early Christians shared everything they had. Marx believed that a compelled form of this would actually benefit society once a communist revolution happened. This also meant that patriotism, nationalism, capitalism, any of the liberalism, republican government, any form of representative government was absolutely unnecessary and was completely tied to the bourgeoisie and the capitalists. So basically, all of this would have to be abolished as well. Religion, which was an old cultural mainstay, was one way that the upper classes had used to control the lower classes by making them superstitious and fearful. Therefore, religion was the opiate of the masses. It kept them sedated and prevented them from realizing their class-conscious position and the need for violent revolution in order to overthrow other people. Now, a lot of people have looked at Marx and compared him to communist dictators throughout history and said, well, Marx wasn't particularly violent and never really killed anyone. That is true, but Marx advocated for violent revolution basically in all of his writings, believing that that was probably the only way that you could ever get a communist society. The great way to get a proper communist society would be through violent revolution. Marx did try several of these revolutions, but they didn't work quite the way he wanted. Collective bargaining, unionization, different things like this, which are commonly touted by left-wingers as socialistic, actually prevent Marxism from actually taking hold. Marx's ideas never really catch on. People aren't willing to totally abandon their nationalist or cultural principles in order to embrace a revolution that will make them all equal. As long as they get what they want, basically concessions from their bosses and overlords, they will remain happy to be in this dynamic. Basically kind of disproving the idea that that workers were always in a combative, conflicting relationship, a relationship of tension and anger with their overseers and factory owners. So Marxist principles, although very popular amongst many people in the West, did not catch on in Europe the way that he thought they would, and communist revolution never really fomented the way he would have liked it to. The truth of the matter is that industrialized societies had such strong historical and cultural apparatuses that basically, as long as workers were getting the rights they wanted, there was no need to actually engage in some sort of communist revolution that would destroy all wealth whatsoever and overthrow the society at large. So Marx was quite ignorant of how capital deepening, the development of worker and overseer relations were, and Marx's principles, despite being extraordinarily and exhaustively explained in his extremely famous Capital, actually never really caught on in Western Europe the way he thought they would. How does this relate to the Soviet Union? Well, the truth of the matter is that Marx's ideas didn't catch on in Europe, but they did catch on in Russia. Like I have said before, the Russian Romanov family, the Tsars, were very opposed to any idea of reform throughout much of the early parts of the 19th century. They suppressed heavily any sort of political dissension, creating a strong Streisand effect where basically everybody in their society was, where politics was illegal, political discussion was illegal, basically made people extraordinarily politically radical and open to the most radical changes proposed. Violent revolution to overthrow a corrupt and very, very oppressive government seemed more likely than calling for representative democracy, which would make more sense for a government that was open to free speech principles. The Russian Tsars certainly were not open to this. Therefore, communism and socialism seem to be healthy alternatives. And again, communism and socialism, although Marx sees a differentiation between them, that socialism leads to Marxism, this is what Lenin himself would say later on, they are indeed interchangeably used. That's all socialists are communists. And communists may have different factions and ideas, but they all advocate for socialism as either the stepping stone or basically the end goal of communism. Marx believed that there would be a natural result where all conflict would end once communism came about. Basically, the dialectical materialism that had created tension in all living species for all of human history would come to an end once global revolution and communism were achieved worldwide, whatever the cost may be. You would basically have complete peace and societal nirvana at the cost of a few billion lives. Who knows if that would work or not. This is exactly the doctrine that Leon Trotsky would later propose in the 1920s and be berated by Stalin for approving of. So what happens next? How does this get to Russia? What does this have to do with the Russians? Marx is a German. He's a Jew. Yes, by the way, Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Leon Trotsky were Jews. Get over it. I'm not going to talk about this nonsense anymore. Everybody wants everybody to be Jewish. But you know what? That's about it. How does this get to Russia? Well, Marx's ideas aren't, like I said, hugely popular in Europe. He dies in the 1880s. But they do catch on in Russia, where certain writings, like What is to be Done, and other radical revolutionaries are gaining steam. Any sort of calls for political reform are soon met with some of the most radical forms of socialism and communism that would be forbidden in other places in Europe, like Great Britain or France, which just goes to show the lack of political representation, equal rights, equality before the law, trial by jury, and all of these things that had already been ensconced for centuries in places like France, Britain, and the United States, weren't there in Russia, so people went to the most radical extreme methods to try to achieve them. Russia is also not a mechanized society. Despite the efforts of the great Alexander II between 1855 and 1881, and Russia's huge catch-up when it came to building railroads, such as the Trans-Siberian in the late 19th century, by the dawn of the 20th century, Russia was not industrialized, and the vast majority of people still lived in peasant communities, which were run by councils that were very communitarian and might have been open to some of these communist doctrines called zemstvas. The Russian people were not extraordinarily democratic, and they were not extraordinarily industrialized. They were very religious, superstitious, but they were also the elites, the upper class, the urbanized centers were developing in many ways, and many of them were quite liberal and very skeptical of religion and old haunts. Basically, many people in the Russian elite and upper classes had come to believe that the old things of the government, the feudal system, the system of serfdom, the boyars, the nobility, the ancient and old feudal traditions of Russia that had lasted well into the 19th century when they had been completely abolished in Europe centuries before then, were a symptom of Russia's problems, and every single cultural marking that was tied to this was unnecessary and should be done away with. So religion becomes unpopular with the elites, and this leads to an openness to all sorts of different political philosophies and ideas. Again, the more suppression the Tsar and his forces did on people's political rights, the more people went to more radical extremes in order to do this, such as the People's Will. I'm trying to remember the exact name. They assassinated Tsar Alexander II in 1881 while he was actually working to make Russia a democracy, at least a constitutional democracy. If he had succeeded, the Russian Revolution probably would not have happened, which means the Cold War wouldn't have happened, which means everything would be different in world history today. But Russia really never had a fair experiment in democratic and parliamentarian government. Even the efforts of the Duma after the 1905 revolution against Tsar Nicholas II really don't go anywhere because Nicholas is very, very akin to suspending the Duma to basically get what he wants. And this is what we see from Russia. We see an aging and declining empire run by very powerful people and a 1% that is totally disillusioned in many ways with the 99%. However, this does not make the communist revolutionaries in Russia or the socialist revolutionaries in Russia, which was an actual political party called the Socialist Revolutionaries, this does not necessarily make them advocates of the Russian lower classes. They say they are, but most of them are what are called the intelligentsia. These are well-educated people from good backgrounds who are very urbanized and have a very different upbringing than the peasantry they say they represent, who are advocating for a very small amount of workers who also have a very different background from them. Lenin's father was a superintendent of schools in Russia. Some of these people were the children of wealthy elites. They were well educated. They had exposure to European philosophies and economic ideas, which is how they encountered communism. So the truth of the matter is, the Bolsheviks will claim throughout their history, and the Soviet Union will claim that the Communist Party throughout its history is speaking for the little people. But you really have people who are a very small percentage of the population who are obsessed with power, very economically secure in their own personal lives, who through angst and frustration with the way the system is run, propose revolution all over the place. Now, this isn't to say that none of the peasantry, none of the workers, and none of these people ever participated in the revolution. Neil Faulkner's book, People's History, which takes Howard Zinn's approach of American history and applies it to the Russian Revolution, basically says that, yeah, everybody wanted the Tsar dead and wanted a revolution. This is nonsense, but it is also nonsensical to say that the peasantry, the lower classes, and the working class, the proletariat that was emerging, especially in urbanized centers like St. Petersburg and Moscow, had nothing to do with the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution is a combination of intelligentsia, well-educated elites trying radical political reform and using workers and peasants who are sympathetic to those ideas in order to gain power and establish a communist system. Basically, Lenin is forced, and many people will at this point start talking about Vladimir Lenin in terms of him bastardizing Marxism and ruining Marxism. You wouldn't have lasted long in the Soviet Union had you ever said that during Lenin's life or even afterwards. Lenin believed himself to be the ultimate interpreter of Marxism. And what Lenin changed, he only changes probably for adaptation in order to actually work out the proper Marxist doctrines in Russian history. So you could say what you'd like, but Vladimir Lenin is a communist. By all stretch is. He is not trying to he reinterprets communism for his own cultural context, which is what communists will do all the time in order to seize power. But when you consider the fact that nowhere in Europe had really ever been open to a full-on communist revolution the way Marx had wanted, you have to understand that a pre-industrialized or somewhat industrialized society, a semi-industrialized society, is far more open to communism because of radical political suppression than a country that believes in trial by jury, political rights, freedom of speech, and liberal democracy. So liberal democracies just really aren't open to communism. The only societies that are suffer from heavy political oppression and feudal and post-feudal societal relationships like Russia and China. And by the way, one of the topics that people voted on today that wasn't as heavily favored as this one is communism in Asia, a topic that I would love to discuss because China is another case study in another communist leader, Mao Zedong, reinterpreting Marx and Lenin to his own means. So Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin, is the leader of the Bolsheviks, which is a joke name because it means the majority. He was a minority of people in the Communist Party in Russia who broke off from the real majority called the Mensheviks, which means minority. But because they wanted to believe that they were speaking for the people, they called themselves the majority party. So that is where the term Bolshevik comes from. The Mensheviks are actually the majority of the communists in Russia for quite some time. And you also have socialist revolutionaries on the far right who are very sympathetic to communism but aren't exactly Marxists themselves. Alexander Kerensky, the leader of the provisional government, who I discussed a few weeks ago during the Russian Revolution, is one of these leaders. Lenin's brother had been killed trying to assassinate Tsar Alexander III in 1887, and because of this, Lenin becomes radicalized himself. Lenin is not his name, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. He uses a nom de guerre or a nom de plume named Lenin, and the reason he uses the nom de plume because he is constantly being hunted by the Tsar's guards, and people are trying to throw him in prison. He is sent to Siberia, he is exiled in the late 1890s, he eventually makes his way to the West, and he is living in Switzerland in the summer of 1917 when he hears of the Russian Revolution. The Germans, trying to pull the Russians out of the war and knowing that Lenin and the Bolsheviks are the only real political threat to Russia being pulled out of the war, to Russia's war effort, because they have constantly been opposed to Russian involvement in what they consider to be an upper-class war, send Lenin back, pay for his way to go back to Russia. Lenin arrives in Finland and is kind of outside of Finland and is seen as an enemy by the provisional government. Now, the way the Russian government worked at this time is you have a division between the provisional government, which oversaw the country, and workers' councils. These workers' councils are called Soviets, so that's where the term Soviet comes from if you didn't know beforehand. The Soviets are far more radicalized than the provisional government, which has a mix of liberals and leftists in it, and the workers' councils are far more sympathetic to communist aims and things like that. The Bolsheviks believe that all power should be given to the Soviets and the provisional government should be abolished, but democratic elections are basically worthless. I would take Marx's doctrine, by the way, of a bourgeois revolution and say that bourgeois revolution occurred in February, March of 1917, but you have a communist revolution so soon after a bourgeois revolution, you have no breathing space. You have no time for the development of actual mechanized capitalism, which Marx believed was necessary for a socialist revolution to occur. So you have about an 8-month period between the fall of the Romanovs and the rise of a bourgeois class, which is trying to create a liberal democracy, and basically getting nowhere. They don't even have free and fair elections until after the Bolsheviks take over. This is where it leads to how do the Bolsheviks gain power, because there's very few people, even in the Communist Party, that are actually Bolsheviks. And the real main reason is because of the Kornilov Affair. Now, you've never heard of this before, probably, unless you've been around the channel for a while, but Levar Kornilov is the leader of the Russian army. The Russian army is fighting the war. The provisional government continues to demand the war be fought, even though it's gaining in unpopularity. Another thing I should probably address is the desertion myth. Now, Sean McKeegan does an excellent job in his book discussing the various different elements of the Russian army that split off, such as the battleship Potemkin and mutinied. But the vast majority of the army remained loyal to the war effort and to their generals. But there were cells of mutinees and mutineers who were able to join the rioters and the police and all the different forces and the unions who had armed themselves in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Moscow in pushing for revolution and change. So there are mutineers. There are people who become, easily impressed by communism and socialist agitators who seep into the ranks of the army and serve in the army, mainly so that they can help overthrow the Russian government. And by spreading chaos and desertion within the military ranks, they can undermine Russia's war effort. If you can pull Russia out of the war in the chaos that follows, you can create a revolution. So it was a long-term effort by the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and other leftists in order to undermine Russia's efforts in the war and create deserters who were armed and sympathetic to communism. The Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks' main difference, by the way, is the Mensheviks believe that this would be a slow-moving process that would have to occur naturally. They're far more doctrinally orthodox Marxists in that regard. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks basically say, the hour is now, we're not going to let it go. And Kerensky could have actually saved his skin. He was very suspicious of the Bolsheviks. He believed they were a bunch of rabble-rousers. But he gets into a beef with Kornilov. Kornilov is impressed upon that the Russian government will fall if he does not seize power in the middle of the summer. He goes to Moscow. He begins gathering some of his forces to leave the front and go to Moscow. And he is scolded and reprimanded by Kerensky for doing this, and because he is scolded and reprimanded, the military backing that the provisional government relied on to protect themselves from workers' strikes, riots, and revolutionary insurrectionists basically falls apart. And the next time that happens in October on a gambler's chance, it's October in the old system. They don't have the Gregorian calendar in Russia, so it's the Julian calendar. But it's, for us, it would be November of 1917. It's actually a successful coup d'etat, which destroys all of the guards in front of the palace and then overthrows the ministers, basically arresting them. And Kerensky eventually makes his way to the United States, where he lectures at Stanford University, of all places. And Marx, and by the way, Lenin is not there. Lenin is in Finland, believing the revolution has ended. And he eventually arrives in Moscow, and the Bolsheviks have basically seized power, and now they have to find a way to keep it because they have a bunch of leftists who are very upset with them. So they say, we will share our power, and we will work on the same premise of producing a communist revolution. Liberals and the government are soon thrown out of power on their ear, and a purge of them starts to begin. The military, which is far more conservative and traditional, and is calling for, and their supporters who are calling for proper democratic elections and an actual formation of a real government in Russia, start to coalesce, and this becomes the backbones of what becomes the White Army in the Russian Civil War. So there's a lot of chaos. Lenin makes his way back to Russia and promises the crowds peace, land, and bread, basically going off of demagoguery and continual appeasing of the Germans, which eventually ends up in the Brest-Litovsk Agreement of 1918, where Russia cedes huge amounts of land to the German Empire in order to get out of the war and allow the Germans to recognize the Soviet Union or the Bolsheviks as the leaders of Russia. The real funny thing about all of this is that the Bolsheviks, who are ardent communists, will constantly make compromises in order to hold on to their power. And they are willing to work with an imperialist colonizing empire that started a world war and has killed millions of Russians in order to do this. And basically, there are many moments in the lives of Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, Marx, or any of these people where you can basically see themselves saving their own skin. And cowardice is not, and there are many brave heroes in the battlefields of the Russian Civil War, and of course in the last World War between the Soviets and the Germans. I'm not saying that. The Soviets are known for their military bravado for a reason, but there are many instances where you can find communist leaders who style themselves as great military minds acting like cowards. So Lenin basically says, okay, we're going to have an election and we're going to see what actually ends up happening. And we will respect the rights of the elections, but we also want all power given to the Soviets. The election that follows in February of 1918 elects the Socialist Revolutionaries overwhelmingly, who have gained a lot of popularity with the peasantry. The results are frustrating to Lenin, and Lenin basically brings an army of Red Guards into the capital and froze out all the other political parties, basically banning anyone who is not a Bolshevik from the Constituent Assembly and from the Planning Committee, which becomes the basis for the head committee for the Soviet Union. I know this is a lot, and maybe this live stream lecture should be about the Bolshevik Revolution and communism, but the truth of the matter is you cannot understand the Soviet Union, the Cold War, Lenin, or Stalin if you don't know any of this. And besides, if you haven't noticed, I'm quite passionate about it. I know an absolute lot about it. So I was wondering, could I get through the Soviet Union in an hour? I certainly cannot. So it looks like it's a 4-part Russian history series. I'll try to get through Stalin. I'll try to get to the World War. And then maybe the second part of the lecture is the Soviet Union during the Cold War and modern Russia. But Lenin basically cheats, makes an illegal chess move, and throws out, and the one with the weapons and makes the rules. So the others are thrown out on their ear. The socialists, the Mensheviks are disenfranchised, but not before Leon Trotsky joins the Bolshevik Party, which is a huge moment. The Bolsheviks wouldn't have survived without Trotsky serving as an ambassador to the Germans, basically placating the Germans to stop offenses against the Russian army, and then later basically creating the Red Army to fight against the White Army in order to actually create a formidable fighting force that used the mechanized, urbanized areas of Russia to their advantage in order to destroy the White Army in the Civil War. The Russian Civil War is a huge tragedy. It is one of the saddest periods in human history. It's the Holocaust, the Holodomor, Mao's genocides aside, what the Russians do during their civil war is some of the most barbaric stuff in history. Both sides commit horrific war crimes, the whites and the reds. The Red Army is improvised, but it has the population centers and the mechanization in order to produce a well-equipped army that, thanks to Trotsky's oppressive discipline, is actually a formidable fighting force by 1919-1920 that is able to repel most of the White Army. Kornilov is killed soon after the war begins, and he is I forget the name of the guy who takes over for him, but he leads the White Army in the west. There's an Admiral Kolchak in the east leading his forces, and they make good incursions against the Reds, and there are times where it looks like the Bolshevik Revolution is going to fall. But receiving support from the Germans while continuing to promise to pull out of the war and let the Germans have whatever territorial land they want allows the Bolsheviks to gain enough resources to build an army. They also practice huge amounts of collectivization, the seizing of land, property, and resources in order to fund and support their armies. This leads to the privation of millions of people, and many people resort to cannibalism and starvation in Russia between 1918 and 1921. Millions of people begin to starve to death because of the collectivization of farmland by the government, which basically uses all of that to feed their armies. So this is something that happens in war everywhere. It's not just in the Soviet Union. It's not just under Lenin. But the horrific amounts of human suffering and brutality by both sides is pretty horrible. Pogroms are quite common by the White Army. They also engage in all sorts of horrific war crimes, abuse of women and children, if you know what I mean. All throughout the countrysides, and this makes them extremely unpopular with the peasantry, who defaults to service in the Russian to the Bolsheviks. The Russian army itself, the Red Army, is prone to horrible desertion until Trotsky basically puts a bunch of guys with pistols in the back row and says, if you run away, we will find you and kill you, but if you fight, you might live. A strategy that will serve Stalin well during Barbarossa and the German invasion 25 years later. Or 20 years later. I need to take a sip of coffee, but please take a sip of whatever you're drinking. Hope you're enjoying the lecture. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. I don't know if there will be time for Q&A. I need to wrap this up, actually, because we're already at 45 minutes, but it's just fascinating stuff. And if you're wondering about my future doctorate, I have a master's right now. If you're wondering where my doctorate's going to be, it's going to be right here in one of these topics that I'm discussing. So what happens next? The Russians the untold amounts of suffering. There's also a lot of chaos. There's anarchists. There's people basically roaming around the countryside as rogues, brigands, and pirates, stealing and abusing as much as they want. There are peasants who really do not like either side. They form partisan military groups called the Greens. And they will be a thorn in Lenin and the Bolshevik side for time to come, because this revolution is supposed to be for and by the peasantry, and the peasantry isn't crazy about you. Lenin takes it as a personal insult when this happens. He also survives an assassination attempt by a woman in 1918, and it sets in his mind, he's injured in his neck, an idea of kind of paranoia about the Russian people, about the Russians, and this will lead him to one of his most cataclysmic decisions, probably one of his more infamous ones. And although some historians seem to believe that this was made individually, it definitely falls in line with, at the very least, this decision falls in line with what the Marxists were doing in 1918, seeking to destroy and divest all of the sources of patriotic fervor amongst the White Russians, who were not necessarily monarchists, but were at least open to friendly treatment of the Tsar and had some patriotic sense. Most of them, again, are in the military. The Bolsheviks murder the Tsar and his family in July of 1918, killing Nicholas II, not allowing him to leave the country, and not allowing him to be rescued by an approaching army of White Russian soldiers who will try to then use him as a rallying cry to the peasantry. So the brutality against the nobility continues. It's not just the Tsar and his family that are killed off. Churches are raided, their icons and gold are stolen from them in order to help fund the Bolshevik army. The Red Army becomes a strong and powerful and impressive force, and the chaos of the Communist Revolution starts to leak into Western sources. The West sends forces, the British and the Americans and the French, to stop the Soviet Union and to stop the it's not the Soviet Union, to stop the Bolsheviks from winning the war, because they know the Bolsheviks are trying to get Russia out of the war. They want Russia back into the war, and they know the White Army has agreed, the White Russians will put Russia back on the front against the Germans. It's a very interesting reality. If the Americans don't join the war and the Russians get knocked out in 1917, then are the Germans the victors of the Great War? Is there some sort of compromise on the Western Front? It would have been very fascinating to see. But the West sends forces to bring the Russians back into the war, and they fight against the Soviets, against the Bolsheviks, against the communists, and eventually they pull out after the war ends at the end of 1918. So the White Army is disorganized, it's oppressive, it does horrible things, it has no discipline within its ranks, desertions are common there as well. Its mistreatment and abuse of peasantry and Jews and people in the countryside make it extremely unpopular. Its disorganization does not lend any credit, and once the Western armies are out of the way, the Bolshevik and the Red Army is fully robust, the scourge begins, and they're eventually heavily defeated by Trotsky's forces. So by 1921, the Bolsheviks have been able to restore order. The Germans have given back the concessions they originally made in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk because of their size, and Poland has gained its independence. Now, Poland is really interesting because Lenin believes that this power vacuum created by the destruction of empires at the Treaty of Versailles is actually an excellent opportunity to spread communism into Central Europe. He believes there can be that the political chaos of these de-imperialized areas would be the perfect opening for communist revolutions in Germany, Hungary, and Poland. He also believes that mechanized revolution is now possible in countries that are economically suffering post-war, like Great Britain and France. It doesn't go anywhere in Great Britain and France, but the Spartacists gain some sort of foothold in Germany for the Weimar Republic. With the help of the Allies, is able to defeat them. The communists in Hungary are defeated by a fascist dictator, Admiral Lathos, who will control the country until the next World War. And in Poland, this is probably the most interesting story from this time period that if you know about it, you probably have never heard of. But the guy with the greatest mustache in all of human history, Field Marshal Józef Pilsudski, is able to withstand an invasion from the Red Army in 1921 and keep in 1920 and 1921 and keep Poland from falling into communist clutches. It's an incredible story of how Poland, actually being much smaller, basically barely being recreated as a country, used its own nationalist tendencies. Remember, nationalism is anathema to communists, in order to destroy and defeat the Red Army, which was much bigger and much stronger and had all the momentum. This is a huge upset in world and a huge moment in world history, because who knows where the Bolsheviks would have continued with war in Europe throughout the 1920s if that was the case. By this defeat, the suffering of the people, the continual attacks from rogue peasants, the Greens, and the immense amount of millions of people who have died in the war and the revolution and the civil war convinced Lenin that he has probably bitten off more than he can chew by trying to force Russia into the square peg into the round hole. So he makes a tactical retreat, like he had done many times before in many different ways. He calls for the opening of markets, and this leads to the new economic policy, which basically creates a mixed economy, which basically says to the peasants, you can grow what you want and sell what you want so that we don't all starve to death. This is seen by many people as evidence that Lenin was not a real Marxist or communist. And I think it's just him being strategic and him knowing that it wasn't working. Russia barely survives. The idea that Russia inevitably became communist because of how they were mistreated by the Tsar and the upper class is ludicrousness. Is ludicrousy. If you've listened to this lecture with any sort of goodwill and thoughtfulness, you've realized that that's not the case. You've realized that very many times this Bolshevik revolution almost completely fell apart, and Russia was almost too mechanized to actually tolerate a communist revolution, if you think about it that way, because the Western European powers weren't open to it at all, and the Russians barely get into it. And there were many times where the whites could have won, the Germans could have reneged on their promises, the foreign interventionism could have continued, Churchill wanted it to continue, for instance, and Lenin knows he survives by the skin of his teeth. But he's not surviving physically. He is emaciated, he is depressed, he suffers a series of debilitating strokes between 1922 and 1923, and his revolution seemingly has not gone the way he wanted to, so he dies in many ways bitter and broken in 1924. And I think the background of Lenin at his death, this guy who is seen by so many as such a robust figure. That is all later attributions. Now, Lenin is a brilliant man. He's extremely intelligent. He's a great speaker. He knows how to promise people things like his slogan of peace, land, and bread in order to get what he strategically motivated. But there's a glorification of him as this vanguard which he had created, this vanguard of communist supporters, which was the Communist Party, basically. And I'll explain that in a second. But the real truth of the matter is he wasn't a glorified leader bringing the revolutionaries right to the front of the Winter Palace. He was in many ways, throughout much of his life, throughout much of his time in power, behind the scenes, running things, and often out of the way of any real substantial danger. So this is him in 1923. He can't talk. He's paralyzed, and it's quite tragic if you like him, and it's quite fitting if you hate him, to realize that this man who had never got to see the fruit of his labor of communism actually coming to fruition in Russia, the Soviet Union. He's in the middle of a political retreat at the time of his death. And he's also struggling heavily with the fact that he's not this glorious revolutionary war leader. He's had to make compromises in order to survive. He's had to be cunning. He's had to be cruel. He's had to kill millions of people, either in war or outside of war. Starvation, the war communism might have cost up to 5 million lives during the Civil War in order for the Bolsheviks just to hang on to power. Lenin believed that the dictatorship of the proletariat was a noble idea. But he also believed that in order to actually carry it out, for the proletariat to be ready, they needed assistance from people who were educated and ready to fight at the drop of a hat, and that was the revolutionary vanguard that he advocated that became the basis for the Communist Party. So the Bolsheviks renamed themselves the Communist Party in 1922, and I think in that same year, Lenin renames it Russia the Soviet Union, which of course controls areas like Ukraine and Estonia, the Baltic states. I think it controlled Estonia, or maybe not, but Kazakhstan, things like areas like this that will later be their own independent countries were controlled by the Soviet Union as one giant entity. And again, at this point, there's no influence over Hungary. There's no influence over Czechoslovakia. There is no Iron Curtain. Germany is not divided into two spaces. It's just the Soviet Union. It is the only communist state in the world. A couple years later, Mongolia becomes the first Asian communist state. And when I lecture on communism in Asia, I'm going to start with Mongolia and not with Mao. Lenin is certainly not as brutal as Stalin, but if given the chance, he might have been just as brutal. And Lenin was very, very willing at many very, very important periods to use cruelty, oppression, and murder in order to achieve his ends. People like to look at Lenin in two ways, and I think both of them are really bad. One, they look at Lenin as a con artist who ruined Marxism. Not true. Lenin, you would have been shot if you had thought that in the 1920s in Russia. They look at him as a con man, but they also look at him as a con man who perverted communist teaching. And you can make whatever arguments you want, but alteration was necessary for communism to actually survive. So you could say that in many ways what Lenin says to Marx theoretically is, yeah, I'm going to change this. Well, why are you going to change it? Well, because it's too damn idealistic to actually get anywhere. So I'm going to have to revamp it, and it's going to have to apply to this area because I can't fit a square peg in the round hole, but I can cut it into a circle and make it and put it in the round hole. And that's what Lenin does with Marxism. And there were no square pegs. So Lenin gets a bad rap from hardline leftists, and of course people on the right and people who hate communism hate him for other reasons. Lenin also gets the reputation that he wasn't he's not. People who apologize for him or defend him, he wasn't as bad as Stalin. Stalin's the real nasty guy, and Mao. But if Lenin had lived, everything would have ended up well. Lenin used poison gas to kill hundreds of thousands of peasants who lived in the forests, or tens of thousands of peasants who were hanging out in the forest away and hiding from the Red Army in 1922. Lenin was extremely brutal and extremely horrific when he absolutely needed to be. I don't even know if you can absolutely need to be, but when he felt he needed to be. And sometimes because it meant he could stand power. You can see Lenin as very power hungry, but you can also see him as extremely precise in using cruelty and destruction to get what he wanted. So the idea that communism started off fine in Russia and everything was golden, and then all of a sudden you run into Stalin and Stalin just ruins everything, isn't true. Orwell's idea that Major in Animal Farm is Lenin is not correct. At least people who interpret Major as Lenin. Lenin is pretty brutal in his own way. Not as much as Stalin, and not as much as Mao, but certainly if you're looking at cruel dictators who kill lots of people, Lenin is one of those cruel dictators who kills lots of people. Anyways, and yes, this is the story of the famous movie and book Dr. Zhivago. This is the story. This has been told in Reds, which is a complete propaganda piece by a leftist journalist who is totally seeking to justify it. As Sean McKeegan points out about people like George Bernard Shaw and many of the writers of the far left in America and Europe who glorify the revolution, they saw what they wanted to see. They wanted to see the revolution. They wanted to see the peasants who were in the streets. They didn't want to see the peasants who were resorting to cannibalism in order to find food. Yeah. Anyways, this lecture has basically turned into a lecture on Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So this is the Lenin Bolshevik lecture. I can't even get to Stalin. I can't sum up Stalin in 5 minutes. Stalin is so important to human history. I will finish with the Trotsky-Lenin fight, which I think is a stupid historical position that the two of them were fighting for power. Orwell gives us that in Animal Farm. I love Animal Farm as a book. I do not love all of its historical ideas, but actually I do love a lot of its historical ideas because it's a warning. It's a parable. So Leon Trotsky is an interesting guy, and by interesting I mean deadly. He showed nothing but cruelty to the forces that he ran against the whites, and he also does what he can to absolutely butchers the battleship Potemkin mutineers, who were the earliest revolutionaries in the army, when they oppose what Moscow is trying to do. Trotsky and Stalin are two very different men who have two very different political ideologies. Trotsky is an idealist who believes that the revolution needs to be a global thing, and if a communist revolution could actually occur globally, then you could have a proper communist revolution and things would work out. The reason they weren't working out was because the revolution had not spread. So he spends the rest of the 1920s calling for global revolution. Now, some historians and some people believe that Lenin wanted Trotsky to take over for him. That's not true. Lenin did not like Trotsky, and he did not like Stalin. He especially did not like Stalin. Lenin believed that the Communist Party the vanguard should run the party after he died. He did not pick Trotsky. He never picked Trotsky. There is nothing that ever indicates that he picked Trotsky to take over for him after he died. In fact, I think Lenin knew what Trotsky was about. And I think he would, on a good day, would have agreed with him, but on a bad day would have been like, this is dangerous. Lenin proved over and over again he was more than willing to retreat when necessary. Trotsky is far more bold, despite being a late comer to the party. He's also extraordinarily opportunistic, if you think about it. thoughtfully. He didn't start off as a Bolshevik. He joined when the Menshevik ship was slipping. By the way, the liberals, the ever communists, the socialist revolutionaries, the church, anyone who opposed the party ran into huge amounts of problems. All other political parties are banned. So you're not much different off than you were under the Tsarists. And if you really hated the Tsar's police, secret police that suppressed political thought, well, you're not going to love the NKVD, what eventually turns into the KGB. The government controls the media. This is where you eventually get what becomes known as Pravda, truth, which is propaganda. And so Trotsky runs into Stalin. And Stalin is not a leading member of the revolutionary vanguard in Lenin's earliest days. Stalin rises in the party because he is given the job of the general secretary. He's not considered as intellectual as a Marx or a Lenin, although Stalin believed he was and wrote a lot about this. Trotsky is seen as a communist intellectual. Stalin is seen as a pencil pusher. But he uses his pencil pushing to basically gain a following of loyal bureaucrats and members of the party, apparatchiks as they're known, who work on the Central Committee and in the Constituent Assembly and are willing to side with him on major issues. He basically breeds his own line of soldiers, of fighters, which will become his Red Guard, and his own line of political supporters. And these people, the Stalinists, will basically side with him and turn the wheel more and more against Trotsky. Trotsky wants to end the new economic policy, institute collectivization and communism as soon as possible, and start fomenting communist revolution everywhere. And while Stalin is okay with all of these things in theory, he believes that it is better to actually continue the economic recovery began by the new economic policy of Lenin, and he extends it. This is horrifically anti-communist by Trotsky's standards and leads to continual opposition. Stalin is very good at turning the party's propaganda machine against him more and more, and eventually Trotsky is forced to flee to Mexico City. Stalin will later send his own soldiers to hunt down and kill him in Mexico. And this is the story of the movie Frida, by the way. Trotsky meets with communists and revolutionaries all throughout the world, particularly Diego Rivera and his wife Frida Kahlo. Were they married? I don't know if they were married. And Frida Kahlo, if you don't know, is the famous woman with the unibrow Anthony Davis look. If you want a little art history, I hope Frog Physics liked that one. And Diego Rivera is known for his very famous murals, but these are two communists that Trotsky spends time with. The movie shows him having an affair with her. I don't think that's true. But Lenin will hunt him down and kill him in Mexico in 1939 or 1940, I think. But basically, this is the Napoleon and Snowball from Animal Farm. And it's and Animal Farm is so brilliant in many ways. I know I said I disagree with certain parts of it, but that's an actual correct, really, really good understanding of Lenin and Trotsky, or Stalin and Trotsky. And Stalin also pushes out Nikolai Bukharin, who believes that in some sort of moderate form, these are all leaders. Oh, wait, I blanked for a moment. These are all leaders of the Communist Revolution, Bukharin and Trotsky, who have more pedigree and more claims to fame and more direct connection to February of 1917 and October of 1917 than Stalin himself does. But Stalin will make quick work of them. And Stalin is quite cunning in many of his approaches, and he's able to use that knife precision brutality and timing to his advantage over and over again to remove communist leaders who have been hugely influential since the formation of the Bolshevik Party itself and later on the Soviet Union. So by the end of the 1920s, the Soviet Union has been around for less than a decade. The scare of communism, the scourge of communism, has struck fear into the hearts of many Westerners. This is why the Red Scare happens in America at this time. And communism and Russia has somewhat stabilized and now has awoken to find itself communist, kind of out of nowhere. And then you end up having a giant war because of it. Millions of people die, and now you have they're remaking Russia the Bolsheviks get to remake Russia in their image under Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, and now Stalin is the only one left, and Stalin will basically now get to remake the Soviet Union in his image for the next 25 years. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin is the indisputable leader of the Soviet Union, and Stalin, again, just like Trotsky, just like Lenin, just like Marx, deserves his own live stream lecture. In fact, I might have already given one on Stalin. But next week, here's what I'm going to do. Next Sunday, I'm going to do the rest of the Soviet history and modern Russia. I promise I can get through Stalin and then Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and the rest, and get to modern Russia. And we can finish the Russian history series. This took a lot longer than I thought it would, but there's so much history that I wanted to share with you, and I really appreciate you listening and paying attention to it because, again, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of really wonderful info available, and I think this is probably something you haven't learned about before because when I read this stuff in Richard Pipe's book, A Concise History of the Russian Revolution, I felt I was an expert on the Russian Revolution. But reading Pipe's book made me realize that I wasn't an expert on the Russian Revolution. There's a lot more to it than I think. And that's his concise guide to the Russian Revolution. His general work, The Russian Revolution, which has been re-edited over and over again, is like 1,200 pages. I haven't gotten around to reading it, and if somebody gives me a super chat, maybe I can afford to buy it, but no pressure there. And so this is part of the mystery of what Russia is. You can't have Russia without the Soviet Union. De Gaulle constantly called it, Charles de Gaulle, the Soviet Union, or Russia, during his tenure in French politics, despite it being the Soviet Union. And so now you've learned the story of how Russia becomes the Soviet Union, how it overthrows the Romanovs, how the communists usurp the revolution, and how Stalin usurps everybody to solidify his political power, and that's going to lead to disastrous results, but all sorts of huge fundamental changes in Russian history. And I'm probably going to start off next Sunday's live stream lecture with an homage to Nick Fuentes, who has said that Stalin, he is a huge admirer of Stalin. Someone on the far right of American politics, right to the right of Benito Mussolini, saying Stalin he's a great admirer of Stalin. That deserves a deeper dive, and I'm going to explain why people have admired Stalin and why that's probably a mistake. I think it's a mistake to admire any of these people, really, to be quite honest with you. I think it's a mistake to the Russian Orthodox Church made Nicholas and his family saints. I don't think that they're worthy of that. No offense to the church. The church can do whatever it wants, but Nicholas II was a terrible leader who led his country into a ditch from which it would take 75 years to get out of, and probably still really isn't out of to this day. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed it. I'm not done yet. I know we've gone over an hour. Please like and subscribe. Like I said, I will take another 15 minutes to answer your questions about the Russian Revolution, Stalin, Lenin, and Trotsky, or any other form of history that you would like to discuss. It's a post-lecture Q&A. And hopefully Harsh put the videos for the Russian Revolution, my tier ranking list of the czars, and I don't have a full-length video on Lenin, but I have an entire series where I talk about Russian history and Russian czars, so I talk about Lenin and Stalin quite a bit. And in my opinion, Stalin, when it comes to dictators, is the epitome of dictators. So next week's lecture is going to be quite interesting, and we hope you join us Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. We also will have our Q&A at Friday at 6 and Saturday at 3. So, other questions about history and social studies. Let me see here. And I gave a disclaimer, but history is not very friendly during Russia. Russian history can be very unfriendly, particularly as Jay-Z is pointing out in this time period. Assuming something of someone is my great-grandfather's family had not killed Rasputin, we would have remained in power to this very day. I don't know that the Romanov execution, the Romanovs family members killing Rasputin in 1916 has anything to do with the events of 1917. I really, really don't. And you're going to want to check out all of the sources I mentioned: 10 Days That Shook the World by John Reed, Neil Faulkner's People's Guide to the Russian Revolution. You're going to want to look at Richard Pipe's Concise History of the Russian Revolution, which is his smaller work on it. And you're going to also want to read Sean McKeegan's Russian Revolution, which I think is probably the best. But I've read oodles on this. Sheila Fitzpatrick also has kind of this seminal, like 200-page, it's really easy to read, really accessible work. I don't like her book about the Soviet Union, which I'll talk about next week, but she is considered the premier standard, although Richard Pipe, it depends on who you want. If you want a more left-wing perspective, you'll read Sheila Fitzpatrick, who's more sympathetic to the revolution. If you want a right-wing perspective, you'll read Richard Pipes. Now, I don't care about Pipe or Robert Conquest. I don't care about Pipes' politics. I care about his analysis of history, and I learned more about Russian history from Richard Pipes than any other historian I have read. The man's knowledge of the Russian people is incredible. Pipes gets a bad rap in the historical community because he worked for the Reagan administration, which is a no-no to historians because historians generally, my field is generally a left-leaning, left-wing field. Which doesn't remember Ronald Reagan that well, and therefore doesn't remember Richard Pipes that well. But you can't argue with knowledge, regardless of what Pipes' political conclusions are to that. So yeah, I'm still waiting for Hard to Please guy to tell me which mistakes I have been making. Let me see. Other questions. How did Nikita Khrushchev survive Stalin? Khrushchev wasn't a high-ranking member. He was the leader of the Ukrainians, and it was really going to be Lavrentiy Beria who took over after Stalin, which is, thank God it didn't, because if you're talking about the Epstein files, Lavrentiy Beria was a child serial offender, just on the level of him. Stalin's going to bring up his own vanguard of generals, Zhukov and Beria, and a man named Molotov, which is the inspiration, yes, for the Molotov cocktail. Khrushchev is kind of a surprise to take over. Stalin's death really, it kind of comes out of nowhere, and you're going to have to learn more in the live stream lecture next week. How did the world react to the Russian Revolution? Again, people on the left were love this idea of a change in finally achieving a socialist state. A lot of people who were more traditional were absolutely horrified. Suspicion and fear ruled the day. There's also the World War. There's also an influenza pandemic. It just seemed like everything was falling apart on 1919, 1920. And if you want to know how the U.S. reacted to it, the fear of anarchism, socialism, and communism, anarcho-communism, and things like that, motivated the Sacco and Vanzetti trials, where 2 Italian immigrants who were also socialists were killed, were executed for murdering someone they didn't murder because they were Italian and anarchists. Fear of communism was huge from the start. But by the late 1920s and early 30s, most of the Europeans had softened their approach to the Soviet Union and were open to it existing. They realized this was just how it was. You said learn about the Civil War. Definition from the Officer Dictionary. War between groups of people in the same country. Yes, I'm aware of what a civil war is, Steve. Explain the difference, red, white armies, and give a bit more background, how they arise, ended. Yeah, I gave a lot today and yesterday's Q&A about that because somebody was asking about the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War. But the Red Army is formed really by Trotsky's ingenuity, brutality, and cruelty. They have the main cities like Petrograd or St. Petersburg and Moscow, and they use them to their advantage to actually build a formidable fighting force. And with discipline and with political commissars ready to shoot those who attempt to desert, the Red Army proved to be an effective and cruel killing machine, and it would prove that for the next 70 years. The White Army is far more disorganized and sequestered into different groups that eventually the remnants of them will either be hunted down and killed or will run into exile. There's a famous story of Odessa being this port city, or was it Sevastopol, where a bunch of the White Army is able to flee at the very end of the war. Kolchak's forces in the east don't have such luck. He's hunted down and murdered, along with all of his lovers. He had like 8 women he was sleeping with at the same time. But these were basically remnants of the liberals and the old order who wanted some sort of democracy for Russia, if not the return of a constitutional monarchy. So, I read a book about Sacco and Vanzetti a long time ago. People get spooked by anarchists. Yeah, well, particularly anarcho-communists. You don't have anarcho-capitalism doesn't bring the same result, especially in capitalist countries. How did the Finnish take advantage of Russia splitting? They used that to gain their own independence in the wake of the end of the war and gain some land from the Russians. And again, Lenin was staying in Finland before he shows up in Moscow after the Winter Palace is stormed in November of 1917. The American Expeditionary Army in Siberia. Yeah, there were American forces who were sent to Russia and eventually went home because they thought they would have had to help the whites fight the Reds. If Russia was a food, what would it be? It would be... Russia's a tough one because if Russia had a national food, you can think of things like borscht. Pierogies are Polish, but the Russians have a derivative of those. I think the Russians are their favorite fish. They are a stern, hard, meaty sturgeon. The fish that they eat and the fish that they get their caviar from. The Russians are a sturgeon. Borscht is delicious, by the way. If you haven't had Russian food, have it. It's really good. Well, and it's very good for you. It's actually quite healthy. And sour cream. And I watched a really good video. I forget who he is. He's the, is it Meal Through History or Eating Through History or something like that? He had a great video on beef stroganoff. So go watch my video on the Russian Civil War, Russian Revolution. Go watch my video on Peter the Great, which Harsh should put in the chat. And then watch my tier rank video, and then watch his video, because he explains how it's named after a Russian general who who had dissolving teeth. And wanted something soft enough, and that's why they put the sour cream in with the noodles and the shredded beef. You could also use chicken, and stroganoff is obviously a great dish. What's the specific Russian topic of your PhD are you still considering? It's got to be something here, Gayahan. It's going to be Lenin versus, it's going to be Stalin versus Trotsky. It's going to be the Holodomor, which I'll talk about next week. It could be, it has to be very specific. It could be the efforts of the Soviet Union, the efforts of formation of the Soviet Union, and how the compromises Lenin makes. It could be about Stalin. I know more about Stalin than anyone else, so there's a lot to talk about next week. In addition to his crazy commie brutality, he was actually quite handsome, photogenic in his youth, and was almost going to become a priest, and may have committed matricide. And he is not Russian. Those are some things you probably don't know about Stalin. He is not Russian. He may be guilty of matricide, that's the rumor, and he was also going to be a priest. As a priest, imagine being in his parish, and you miss divine liturgy in the Orthodox Church. That would have been kind of crazy. Yeah, I paid my taxes. Is it true that Lenin was apolitical until his brother was murdered by the Tsar? Yeah, but he was young. He was like 15 when this happened. It was the People's Will. I'm trying to remember. Narodna Voya, which is hard to say, but it's the People's Will. They kill off Alexander II by throwing a grenade at him in 1881. 6 years later, they try to kill his son, Alexander III, the Tsar, and it's Mikhail Ulanov, I think was his name. He tries to kill him. He's executed for it, and Vladimir follows in his brother's footsteps. I'm glad to know more about Lenin, because I always imagined him as a decent, humane leader, but Stalin equals pure evil. That's the reinterpretation of revisionism. If Stalin does not come after Lenin, Lenin gets a bad rap. Lenin could be extremely brutal. So could Trotsky. And I would argue, and this might go into next week's lecture, but Trotsky's advocating for a mass global revolution would have killed far more people than any Holocaust, any genocide of the 20th century. Mass, global, worldwide revolution, the workers of the world uniting, as Marx originally posited to them, to overthrow their countries. Can you imagine how many millions of people would have had to die in order to do that? I don't know the exact numbers, but Russia loses about 20 million people between the start of the Great War in 1914, what I call World War II, and the end of the Civil War in 1921. And that's how many people die from starvation, from disease, from epidemics, from lack of health care, from privation and oppression, from democide, the government basically murdering them, and of course from the war and from the Civil War. The Russian population is absolutely decimated in the 20th century. Then you have the Holodomor. This is before the Holodomor, by the way. This is outside of Stalin killing 20 to 30 million people and the last World War. This is outside of the crimes of Khrushchev and Brezhnev. This is outside of the Gulag Archipelago, which I'll talk about next week. This is outside of all of what the Soviet Union will become known for. This is just the beginning of a larger book that is full of brutality and suffering. And yes, I mentioned at the beginning that most of the Bolsheviks were Jews. Is there anything else we want? Most of the Nobel Prize winners have been Jews. Are we really going to go down this stupid road of they were Jews? Did you know they were Jews? I didn't know that they were Jews. Nobody ever comes on this channel to tell me, did you know this really great person in history was Jewish? It's always, this person who you probably think is bad or who I think is bad was a Jew. And Trotsky was a Jew. And Epstein was a Jew. Yeah, so? Idi Amin was black. He literally ate people. That doesn't mean black people are bad. I mean, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, the Confederacy, the Klan, these are horrible human beings. Does that make all white people bad? No. Nobody ever comes in and says all the great Jews in history, even though there are thousands of them. Religion is a mental disorder. Well, the Bolsheviks, you would have liked the Bolsheviks in that regard because the Bolsheviks were against religion, but they basically kind of made the state the religion, I would argue. Let me see here. Is it true that Lenin was apolitical? Yeah, it was. What specific? Okay, I think I answered all of this. Let's see. What else do we have? Religion is a mental disorder. Religion is a tool that people use. That's all it is. The reason that the Communist Revolution happened in Russia and not the West is because Russia was a half feudal and half capitalist police state with failed experience of liberalism. Yes, that's true. Although they hadn't really experienced liberalism, I would argue. And because they were a police state, you had lack of political expression, so you didn't have an opportunity for real liberal democracy. So you had a polarization and a Streisand effect where the suppression of an idea makes the idea more popular. And therefore, people became more and more radicalized in their left-leaning politics. You don't have liberal Democrats. You don't have liberalism. You don't have classical liberalism or libertarianism in Russia. I don't think you even have that today. You have ardent arch traditionalism versus communism. And that's all it's ever been. There is no middle ground in Russia, in Russian political history. Moderation is very hard to find. The only probable exception is Boris Yeltsin. Have any schools called you about getting your PhD? No. Well, I haven't tried to start the process yet, so no, I haven't gotten any calls. Let me see. Jesus Christ is Lord. Well, that would have been anathema to the Bolsheviks. Lenin wasn't Jewish. Lenin was Jewish. Although there are some people who say he wasn't. Lenin, Trotsky were Jews. Stalin is not Jewish. I don't know. There's other Bolshevik leaders who are Jewish. Marx is a Jew. I think Engels was a Jew. Yes. We're very well aware of the ethnicity of these people. What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Stalin was a, you know what, let's go down this line. Hitler was a Gentile. Stalin was a Gentile. Mao was a Gentile. Do you know that all of the Nazis were Gentiles, basically? Almost all of them? And you know that almost all the members of the KKK were Gentiles? That's not me. And nobody ever says that. Because you know what? Nobody ever thinks in these categories. And then people who make these statements get mad because people don't want to hear them. They say, well, I'm being suppressed, and I should have a right to point this out. Why can't I point it out? It's because the Jews control everything. And I'm like, no, dummy. It's because nobody thinks in these categories anymore. Nobody's that racist. What you think communist revolution is more likely to happen if have feudal in capitalism rather than full capitalist countries? Because Marx was wrong. Marx thought that the people would want it and it would be an inevitability, and he was wrong about inevitability in history. The earlier part of the lecture explained exactly where Marx was coming from and what he got wrong. But it also explains how Lenin had to readjust and turn the square peg into a round hole by cutting the square into a circle. I already said that earlier, sometimes in real brutal fashion. Would you recommend Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace as an accurate picture of literature for its historical context? I've never read it. Tolstoy knows Russia really well. I've read Anna Karenina, and the guy just has a beautiful understanding of not only Russia, but the human mind. So yeah, read it. I don't know how accurate it is. I think it's about the Napoleonic Wars. Do you know the stories involving Yeltsin's missing fingers? No, I don't, actually. Another finding, often overlooked. Lincoln authorized Sherman's march to the sea, and when Lincoln died, Sherman became a peacemaker. Yeah, I don't care if Lincoln authorized the March to the Sea. I think the March to the Sea was necessary. I think the South needed to be destroyed. I'm sorry, but when you enslave millions of people, and then you leave a country, and then you start a war, and then you fight a war, and then you send your men off to die in order to preserve racist slavery, you probably do deserve to get your rear handed to you. They weren't going to stop fighting. The North was fighting an offensive war from the beginning. The South was fighting a defensive war. Black Klansman. No, I haven't. Remember, Sherman gave Savannah to President Lincoln for a Christmas present. He also gave him a re-election to the presidency because Lincoln wasn't going to win. Lincoln needed a platform, and McClellan wanted to end the war. So Steve probably thinks it would have been better if McClellan had been elected because then you'd have millions of people in slavery, hundreds of thousands of men dying for nothing, but at least Lincoln would be out of office. Lincoln gets, Lincoln, I feel so bad for him. He's so put upon in life. Why are we putting more upon him after death? The man who's probably the best president in U.S. history, maybe the best leader in all of Western history, at least in the Western Hemisphere. Did rise of radical Islam have any effect in the Soviet Union, considering that Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, and Tajikistan were part of the Soviet Union? Suppression of religions in the Soviet Union was common. Basically, knowing that you were going to have a hard time in life because you were religious was quite common. So Orthodoxy, the main form, and also Islam were suppressed. No different than the Uyghurs. Yes, I know who William Sherman was named after. I also know that William Sherman was a madman. I also know that William Sherman was just who Lincoln needed to defeat Johnston in the South. People don't focus on that part of the war. They focus on Lee and Grant. But Jeremiah Johnston was an excellent general, and Lincoln and Sherman hunted him down until he surrendered in May of 1865 in Florida, I think. Yeah, it's an incredible it's an incredible story that people don't know enough about. John Breckinridge. Well, Breckinridge ran for president in 1860. He was Buchanan's vice president. Then he served in the Confederate Army. He's an interesting guy, to say the least. He goes from vice president to presidential candidate to secessionist rebel who leads an army of secessionists to kill Americans. And by the way, Jefferson Davis is responsible. I've changed my mind, Steve. Jefferson Davis is responsible for the 700,000 men who died indirectly, but more directly responsible for the hundreds of thousands of men who died from the Confederate Army because he's the one that started the war. And if you don't believe me, go ask, what was his name? Robert Anderson. Go ask Robert Anderson. Go ask what happened at Sumter. Lincoln sent in supplies. Jefferson Davis blows up the ship. Anyways, all right, I'm going to sign off. We went about 20 minutes over just so that you guys can get some questions in, which I always appreciate doing. But we will be back next Friday, Q&A time, Saturday for more Q&A, and then Sunday will be our live stream lecture, and we're going to finish this. I promise you, we will finish this. Even if I have to go over and not do Q&A next Sunday, we will finish Russian history because this has been an ongoing series of lectures, and there's just so much knowledge that I want to impart to you. If I imparted anything, if you learned anything, even if you don't agree with everything I've said, please like and subscribe. We really appreciate the support you can give to the channel. A super chat always helps the channel. We can use whatever monetary aid we get. Whatever you give to this channel doesn't go towards me going to Starbucks. It goes towards me buying better equipment and getting better information so that this channel can be the best possible channel it can be for all of you. I really appreciate that, Obscure. Thank you so much. Hope you don't get mad at me saying this, but can you please insult Che Guevara using a slur? No, I'm not going to use a slur to insult Che Guevara. Farewell, my favorite history goy. Yes, yes, thank you for using a slur, which goy is a slur, but all right. Hars, did you put the videos for the Russian czars, Peter the Great, and the Russian Revolution in the chat? Why won't you? Because slurs are bad. Slurs are bad. They are not funny. Don't you believe he was a bad person? Well, I mean, yeah, I don't think Che Guevara was the greatest person, but I don't use slurs to insult Hitler or Stalin. I don't use slurs. I have to be professional. That's why I don't use profanity. Yeah. Anyways. All right, Hars, I guess Hars is not here. Harry was here earlier, and I guess he's gone, so I don't know. I haven't seen either of them in the chat, so I'm a little surprised today. Usually they do such a good job, but yeah. What do you think of... Okay, so one person, Riff Raff, said F Israel and wants to know what I think of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu is probably... If you want me to give my opinion from a political perspective, I don't share my political opinions usually anyways, but give a super chat. Netanyahu is probably a symptom of being in power for too long and being out of touch with solving the real problems that the area needs. However, the idea that Netanyahu and the Israelis have to play with a fair deck of cards against people who do not play with a fair deck of cards and want to destroy them is such a gross misrepresentation of the problems of the Middle East that it shows a lack of understanding of history and the cultural context. This goes beyond just October 7th. And people have argued with me about this war over and over again on the channel. And I'm going to say to you what I said to them. I have made it very clear what my stance is, and I have gone above and beyond to say what my stance is because it's such a hot issue. You can have a two-state solution. You can have the end of Hamas. You can have the Palestinians stop teaching their children to kill Jews and wanting to destroy them. You can have Netanyahu thrown out of power. You can have all of these things. And many Israelis are okay with it. There are not many Palestinians, unfortunately, who are. There has to be a course correction of the way they interact with each other before anything resembling a two-state solution can actually be constructed. This is where I miss Simon the Bunny, because when people would bring up Israel, Simon would always say, friendly neighborhood history supports a two-state solution, which is historically very hard to achieve, but not impossible. India and Pakistan have done it, so you can do it in Israel. And the British intended for it to be done. And then the Israelis just did whatever they wanted with the Arab-Israeli war. And the Arabs didn't want them to exist, so they did everything they could to destroy them. So there's that too. There hasn't ever been a two-state solution in there. I will say that if you want to be, that you will have a much better chance of living a peaceful, full, enriching life as an Arab Muslim in Israel than you will as a Jew in Palestine. It's just the absolute 100% God's honest truth. You will do better off as a Muslim or a Christian in Israel than you will as a Sunni in Iran, a Shiite in Saudi Arabia, or a Christian in either of those places. And especially, and even if you want to do the whole, well, Christians can do this and that, then then go with Jews. So it just seems to me that these people do not understand history, and that's why they don't understand what's happening in the Middle East. Go watch my live stream lecture about the history of the Middle East, because I actually explain exactly why it is the way it is, and I make a lot of concessions to both sides on this. A lot of people want to say I'm this and I'm that and I'm this and I'm that, but that just shows how radical they have become, because I would like to think, very moderate and very objective about it. Why did Yeltsin fail in converting Russia into a free economy? Too much kleptomania, too much kleptocracy going on in the background. His own personal failings with alcoholism made him ineffective at times. Christians get spit on in Israel all the time. And what happens to them in other areas of the Middle East, Tyler? And yes, some Christians get spit on in Israel. Yes, I'm aware there are ultra-Orthodox communities that hate Christians. You were also aware that all of the Christian holy sites, all of them, are in Israel and are protected by the Israeli government. And some of them that are in the hands of non-Israelis are not protected and are off limits, basically. A Muslim can go into the Villa della Rosa and to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre anytime he wants, and a Jew can too, but a Jew cannot go into Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, despite the fact that the Jewish temple was once there. The double standards are just absurdity. This makes me feel like the Middle East should have stayed Zoroastrian pagan. Zoroastrianism is not paganism, but it wasn't even the Middle East. It's Persia. I don't even see Persia as the Middle East. I need to say, since you mentioned Iran, if a government is not democratically came to power, you cannot judge the culture and most people based on it. That's not true. That's certainly not true. The Soviets come to power non-democratically, and we judge them all the time, Faraz. Let me see. I think I've answered everything. Research finding. People perished in Gettysburg total casualties exceeded 10 times the Allied casualties on D-Day. I don't care. I don't care. Tell me your plan to end slavery apart from a war in 1861. You're Lincoln in March of 1861. How do you end slavery? Buchanan has made a mess of everything. How are you going to bring these states back to the Union? Or how are you going to end slavery? Because Lincoln wanted to end slavery. He wanted to end it over time. And he felt that maybe, how are you going to restrict? What are you going to do? You're going to just let the South go on and be its own country? Which then defeats your total argument that, Lincoln just wanted to put the Union together and he didn't care about slaves. Nonsense. He cared about two different things, because human beings can care about two different things. I can care about getting my Christmas decorations and making sure I have a date for a New Year's Eve party. They're similar, but they're different. But I can do them at the same time. Wow. Let me see. Yeah, Persia wasn't always Islamic. Yeah, but Arabia wasn't always Islamic. But then, to be fair, Israel wasn't always Jewish. And Italy wasn't always Christian. And yeah, so Norse, yes, let's make white people Norse pagans, like the French, who were not Norse pagans, at all. Just, yeah. All right, I'm done. Thanks for joining us. Please like and subscribe on your way out. Love history. Check out all the content we have available for you on the channel. And we will see you again Friday for the Q&A, 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You got a little taste of that, like 25 minutes or so at the end. So I hope you really, really enjoyed that. I mean, white people of America. White people of America are not Norse pagans. They are not historically Norse pagans. America wasn't founded by Norse pagans. It was founded by Christians. So if you want to go by that, you should say that they should become Christians. So, yeah, Faraz, it's bad history. I'm sorry, it's just bad history. Sorry, I'm getting distracted because of bad history. But all right, see you guys later. Take care and have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you on Friday. Bye bye.